What if everything you thought about monsters was wrong? Do you believe that a tribe of giant creatures could live hidden in the forest and trust a 72-year-old grandmother? In the remote mountain town of Pine Hollow, a young boy and a creature thought to exist only in myths formed a silent bond that would change both their worlds forever. These beings aren't monsters. They feel pain. They fear loss. And the truth no one tells you is this: sometimes, humans are the ones who need to learn how to listen. And the only ones they trusted were a grandmother and her grandson. This story is based on a real account from the late 1980s, one that's never been explained or debunked to this day. Watch to the end and discover how a simple folk song, sung in desperation, could bring peace to a dying leader, and why a stone marked with 3 lines became a symbol of an unspoken promise between worlds. Marjorie Lyle, aged 72, and Caleb, just 12, entered that hidden cave with nothing but herbs, blankets, and kindness. They cared for the old creature as if it were family, and in return, they received a silent gesture of trust from an entire tribe that no human had ever seen before. This isn't just a story. It's a reminder that magic still lives in the quiet corners of the world. But once they vanish, they may never return. The sound came again. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks, carried through the pine-buried air like an echo from somewhere older than language. Not the wind, not a woodpecker, not anything that belonged to the normal rhythms of Pine Hollow. It came just before dusk, as it always did. And Marjorie Lyle, 72 years old and half shadowed by the porch light, did not flinch when she heard it. She simply stood there, holding a folded cloth in one hand and a cornbread wrapped tight in the other. Her silver hair, long and loose now, fluttered lightly against the collar of her flannel shirt. Behind her, the cabin breathed a low, tired warmth, yellow light stretching through the seams of the window, the scent of cedar logs burning slow and steady in the hearth. Outside, the evening air was cooling, pine-sweet and still, the kind of quiet that you could feel sitting heavy on your shoulders. She walked out past the porch swing, through the brittle brown needles scattered over the steps, and down toward the edge of the tree line where the light broke against the trunks and vanished between the mossy hollows. The cornbread in her hands was simple, dry-baked with lard and sorghum, an old recipe from her mother's mother. She placed it at the same flat stone, same spot as always, without a word. Just the sound of her knees cracking softly as she knelt. Then she waited. Not for a response, but for silence. It was their way. A long time ago, during a winter that nearly killed her, Marjorie had made a choice most people wouldn't understand. Not even Caleb, not yet. She had found it, him, half frozen and dying, tangled under a wind-felled spruce, his breaths shallow, his fur matted with snow and blood. And though she should have feared him, she hadn't. Maybe because she'd lost everything else. Maybe because some part of her already knew that kindness was the only thing left she could give without needing it returned. She saved him. And after that, he saved her in quiet ways she never spoke of. She never tried to own the creature, never tried to name it. She didn't even call it Bigfoot. That word felt like a joke, a headline, a misunderstanding. What lived in those woods was no monster. It was older than that, smarter, and sacred in a way most people had forgotten how to recognize. Every few days since, for years now, they had exchanged gifts. She left cornbread. They left firewood, wild berries, bundles of cured fern. Once, a feather so long and iridescent, she kept it pressed between the pages of her husband's old Bible. They never spoke. They didn't need to. Inside the cabin, a boy watched her through the cracked curtain. Caleb Lyle, 12, small for his age but sharp-eyed, sat cross-legged beside the window with a notebook open on his knee. He wasn't supposed to know. Marjorie thought she'd hidden it well, but he had seen things. Tracks that didn't match any animal in his field guide. Scratches high in the bark. a heavy presence just outside the light. He'd grown up here since he was 6. His mother had left him like a grocery bag someone forgot in the back seat. Quick, careless, and never came back. Drugs, mostly. Maybe shame. Marjorie didn't press. He was hers now, in the ways that mattered. She gave him rules, space, and what little warmth a tired heart could still offer. Caleb watched her kneel, then rise slowly, pat her legs clean. The woods took the cornbread, as they always did, and Marjorie walked back, quiet as the dusk. Later, after supper, split pea soup, overboiled but still filling. They sat in the cabin's worn glow. The dog, Boone, an old mutt with one cloudy eye, snored beneath the table. The fire cracked. Caleb held a hand near the glass, smearing a line through the condensation. He didn't turn when he spoke. "I saw something," he said, like someone confessing a stolen candy bar. By the fence line, big. Marjorie didn't look up from her knitting. She counted a few more stitches, carefully, then stopped. "Did it see you?" "I don't think so. I think it was watching you." She laid the yarn aside and turned, her eyes soft but unreadable. "You're not in trouble," she said. "But I need you to understand something, Caleb. There are things in this world that don't belong to us, and they don't need to." He frowned. "But what is it?" Marjorie exhaled slowly, pulling the blanket higher around her shoulders. "I don't know what you'd call him now. Some folks say monster, some say myth. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that we respect what keeps its distance." There was silence between them then. Not the cold kind, just the space where truth sits, waiting to be understood. Caleb didn't ask more that night, but his fingers ran absently over the blade of the old knife she'd given him, the one his grandfather carried. And in his chest, a pulse of something stirred. Curiosity, awe, maybe even a little fear. The next morning, the gift was there. A bundle of wood stacked neat, tied with creeping vine, and on top of it, nestled carefully, were 3 red apples. Unbruised, fresh, and not from any tree they knew. Marjorie stood staring at it for a moment longer than usual, her lips pressed thin, hands folded tight. Caleb watched her from the steps. "They don't grow here," he whispered. "No," she said, "they don't." That night, the knocks came again. 3, spaced like the ticks of a dying clock. Caleb stood at the window, frozen, heart thudding. Marjorie didn't flinch. The fire burned lower. Outside, the wind passed through the trees with a hush-like breath through cupped hands. And deep in the woods, something enormous moved between shadows. Not hunting, not hiding, just being and watching. The cabin pulsed like a heartbeat in the cold. And in Caleb's chest, the first thread of a new understanding began to form. That maybe the world was bigger than the stories people told. That maybe some truths didn't need explaining. Just silence and trust. And 3 knocks to say, "I'm still here." Caleb couldn't stop thinking about the apples. 3 of them, lined up like offerings. Shiny and untouched, even though there hadn't been an orchard anywhere near Pine Hollow in decades. They were gone by morning, either taken by raccoons or retrieved by whoever or whatever had left them. But it didn't matter. The message had landed. Something out there had noticed them noticing back, and now something in him had shifted. He started watching more carefully, marking things down in the little green notebook he kept under his bed. Bent twigs at 7 feet high, unexplained drag marks in the moss, bark stripped in circular patterns. The knocks were always 3, and always from the same side of the tree line, just past the ridge where sunlight died early. He kept his questions to himself. Marjorie didn't like loose talk about the woods. She spoke in sideways warnings, the kind that told you everything without saying a word. You didn't chase what was meant to stay hidden. You didn't break silence with loud intentions. You noticed, you respected, that was it. But Caleb was 12. Respect had its limits, especially when wonder got bigger than fear. So one afternoon, just before supper, He waited until Marjorie was inside folding linens. Then he took the path behind the woodshed, past the compost pile, and down into the darker curve of the hollow. Boone followed for a bit, nose twitching, tail low, until the trees thickened and the air turned damp. Then the dog stopped. Just stopped cold. Whined once, and turned back. Caleb pressed on. He kept to the soft ground, where footsteps didn't echo. His boots sank a little into the mossy loam, brushing past ferns and fallen needles. There was no wind, only the soft hush of birds switching places in the canopy above. He followed the breaks in the brush, the scuffed bark, the strangely angled branches, places no deer would reach, no bear would care to mark. And then, there it was, a footprint, wide, deep. 3 toes, ridged and pressed into the mud like a warning or a whisper. Caleb crouched low, breath catching in his throat. It was real, bigger than any boot he'd ever seen, and fresh. Somewhere behind him, a branch creaked. He turned, slow and deliberate. His hand reached instinctively for the old pocket knife clipped to his belt. Not out of threat, just something familiar to hold. And then he saw it, not far, maybe 30 yards, standing half-covered in shadow, one hand resting on the low branch of a pine, its knuckles gray-brown and thick like the trunk it touched. The creature was tall, taller than the tallest man he'd ever seen, covered in thick, matted fur the color of autumn bark. Its shoulders were broad, chest heaving slow, like it was more curious than afraid. Its eyes met his, amber, bright but ancient. Not like a bear, not like a man either. Something in between, with a sadness that didn't belong to something wild. Caleb didn't move. The pocket knife slipped from his hand. It hit the ground with a soft clink, blade half exposed in the leaves. The creature tilted its head, then stepped forward. Caleb's whole body went rigid, heart loud in his ears, legs frozen. He expected it to pick up the knife and vanish, or worse. But it didn't. The creature knelt. One knee touched the ground. A massive hand reached out, slow, careful, and touched the knife. Then it looked at him again, held the knife out, handle first, and placed it back down in the exact same spot it had fallen. It was giving it back. Then it stood, a little straighter, still watching him. Caleb blinked, mouth dry, hands trembling, and then something happened, soft but real. The creature gave a low, breathy sound, almost a hum. Then a second, slightly higher in pitch. Not a growl, not quite a word, but something layered with intent. Caleb swallowed. Then, unsure why, he gave a soft whistle. Just 2 short notes. The creature didn't flinch. It blinked, then tapped its chest once and tilted its head again. A language was being born between them. A moment passed, then another, and just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stepped back. One long stride, then another. It melted into the trees, not in fear, but in knowing, like it had shown him enough. For now. Caleb stood still for a long time. The sun dipped lower, gold light slanting through the trees in a dozen broken angles. When he finally turned to go, his legs felt unsteady, but his heart was on fire. Back at the cabin, the soup was cold. Marjorie didn't ask where he'd been, but she looked at his face a little longer than usual, searching for something. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. The eyes, the sound, the knife. That strange, powerful calm. It wasn't just curiosity now. It was something bigger. A pull, like he'd been invited into a secret older than anything written in books. He got up, quietly, pushed open the front door and stepped onto the porch. The stars were out, scattered like bone chips across the sky. The trees loomed dark and still. And then, faint but certain, 3 low knocks echoed from the ridge. He didn't move, just listened. He wondered if it was the same one, or another, or all of them. Watching, waiting. Inside, Marjorie sat in her chair. eyes closed but not asleep. She had heard it too, and she knew, because nothing was ever really quiet in Pine Hollow. The silence was always speaking, if you knew how to listen. The next morning, Caleb found something by the fence line. A small stack of river stones, 3 across, carefully balanced. On top, a single pine cone, freshly cracked open. He didn't touch it. He just looked and smiled. He knew now. The forest had neighbors, and some of them were paying attention. The moon climbed higher than usual that night, white and swollen like it was watching the world below. Light poured through the gaps in the old pine trunks, silvering the tops of the needled branches and cutting across the clearing like shards of bone. Caleb stirred in his sleep, body half tangled in a wool blanket, breath catching just before the sound came. Low, deep, not quite a roar, not quite human. It vibrated the windows. The fire had gone out. He sat up. The cabin walls seemed to breathe with the noise. Boone whined from under the table but didn't come out. Caleb's heart thudded in his chest, not from fear exactly, but from something colder, older. Like the ground itself had spoken. He crept to the window. There, at the edge of the clearing, half sunk in mist and moonlight, stood a figure, tall, still, and watching, the younger one. He knew it right away. The creature didn't move, not at first. Just stood with its shoulders hunched slightly forward, arms heavy at its sides. Caleb couldn't see its eyes, but he felt them. Like a string had been tied between them the first time they met, and now it was pulling tight. He opened the door without thinking. Cold air spilled in. The sound of crickets vanished. The trees rustled once, then quieted like a crowd hushed by a secret. Caleb stepped barefoot onto the porch. The grass was cold, wet. He followed the figure. It turned without a sound and started walking. No words, no gestures. Just that quiet presence moving through the timberline like it belonged to another era. Caleb followed, past the creek, beyond the hollow, deeper than he'd ever dared. The trees grew thicker, tighter. The path narrowed into a corridor of earth and root. Time felt loose. Minutes stretched and folded like old pages. They climbed down a narrow slope, slippery with lichen and pine rot. He stumbled once, catching himself on a rock slick with damp moss. The creature paused, glanced back just long enough to make sure he was still behind, then kept moving. They passed a break in the stone, a natural arch, bent and twisted with tree roots hanging down like dry veins. Beyond it, the forest changed. It was quieter, but not in the peaceful way. The air felt heavier, warmer. The light dimmed even though the moon was full. Caleb's lungs worked harder. His hands trembled. Then the smell hit him. Smoke. Not fire exactly. Something slower, sweeter, like sap burnt low over coals. He turned a corner and saw the glow. There, tucked between 2 boulders split by time, was a cave. Its mouth was wide, jagged like a torn jaw. Firelight flickered just beyond the entrance, glowing orange and gold against the slick black walls. Shadows moved inside. Dozens. Caleb slowed. The creature ahead of him turned, then stepped aside. An invitation. He crossed the threshold. It was warm inside. Not just from the fire, but from the bodies. The air was thick with breath, fur, and something else. Something ancient. The scent of wet stone, dried berries, old wood. A strange rhythm pulsed in the chamber. Not sound exactly, but movement. Small motions, heavy inhales. The sound of weight shifting, of eyes adjusting to his presence. They were everywhere. Crouched on stone ledges, huddled near the fire. Some were massive, bigger than the one who led him here. Others were smaller, slimmer, with softer features and curious glances. A few had white streaks down their arms. One cradled something in its lap, maybe an infant, its eyes too large for its head. And in the center, he saw him, the old one, lying on a raised shelf of stone, surrounded by moss, blankets, and bundles of bark. His chest rose shallow, labored, arms limp at his sides. His fur was silver gray, matted with time and something darker around the ribs. His head turned slightly when Caleb stepped closer, but he didn't open his eyes. The fire cracked. The tribe watched. Caleb stepped back. The air was too thick. He couldn't breathe. He stumbled once. The younger one reached out, steadying him. Not rough, not demanding, just present. Caleb looked up into those amber eyes and saw something he hadn't expected. Fear. Not for himself, but for the old one. There was no healer here, no medicine, no plan. They had brought him because they didn't know what else to do. Caleb didn't speak. He just looked. From the trembling hand of the old one, to the wet shine in the creature's eyes, to the solemn curve of the others as they stood in total silence. A society without words, but not without grief. Caleb turned to run. He couldn't explain why. The pressure, the heat, the feeling of too many things too big for his small frame. He bolted toward the mouth of the cave. His foot slipped on loose stone. He hit the ground hard, skin scraping against the edge of a fossilized root. He winced, breath knocked out of him. A low sound came then, not growl, not anger, worry. The younger one stepped forward, crouched beside him, and gently lifted him by the arm. Caleb looked up. The creature's face was open, eyes wide, shoulders low. His mouth parted slightly as if to speak, but nothing came. Instead, he touched his own chest, then pointed toward the old one. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. Caleb nodded. The creature helped him stand. Together they turned back toward the dying firelight. The circle of eyes still watched. Caleb walked slowly to the center. He didn't know what he could offer, but he knew why he was there. And as he looked at the elder lying broken, breath fading like the last bit of smoke in a chimney, something inside him shifted. Not fear, but the beginning of understanding. A deep knowing that whatever this was, this tribe, this ancient tether to the wild, it had trusted him, and now it needed him. He knelt beside the elder, put his hand on the furred chest, felt the weak thrum of life under the ribs, then closed his eyes and whispered into the heat. Not words, but something else. Just breath. Behind him, the younger one sat cross-legged. Around them, the tribe remained still, and outside, somewhere far above the cave mouth, the wind carried no sound, only the waiting. Caleb burst through the cabin door, chest heaving, eyes wide with something more than fear, something raw and heavy, something that changed the way light felt on his skin. Marjorie looked up from the kitchen table, a jar of wild honey in one hand, her breath catching before she could speak. He crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed her wrist with both hands, voice low and urgent, shaking like the wind before a storm. "They need us," he said. "They need help." The words landed like frost on glass. Sudden, sharp, impossible to look through the same way again. She didn't ask how he knew, didn't scold him for leaving in the middle of the night. She just saw his face, and that was enough. Marjorie moved slowly, as if memory was waking up inside her bones. She set down the jar, pressed her palm to his cheek, then nodded once. Quiet, like a woman who had waited too long for something she hoped would never come again. They worked without much talk. She gathered a basket and filled it with everything she trusted. Clean water in a tin canteen, the old patchwork blanket with the red squares she'd used when Caleb first arrived, a few slices of dried venison wrapped in waxed paper, 2 rounds of cornbread. Then came the medicine. She pulled a rusted tin box from the cupboard above the sink. Inside it, old mason jars rattled like soft bones. Camphor, dried licorice root, bearberry leaves, crushed ginger, and a thumb-sized bundle of mugwort wrapped in twine. All of it smelled like thunderheads and healing. Caleb didn't know the names, but he recognized the intention. While she packed, he stood at the window, hands clenched at his sides. The forest looked different now. Not darker, but deeper, like it had secrets pushing against the bark, against the wind. Marjorie handed him a small lantern. She took the other. They didn't use words when they stepped into the trees. Just the hush of boots on pine needles and the low creak of woven basket handles swaying with each step. Boone followed for a while, ears low, tail stiff. But the dog stopped halfway down the ridge trail, gave one soft whimper, then turned back, disappearing into the dark like he knew this was not meant for him. The path Caleb took the night before looked different now in the dimming light. More real, more deliberate. He led her past the crooked rocks and the steep descent, through the narrow throat of bent trees and over the split boulders. Marjorie said nothing. Her breath came steady, but her eyes flicked to every branch, every movement, like someone hearing a language again after decades of forgetting. As they approached the break in the stone, a sound rose around them, not from the front, but the sides. Dozens of low breaths, like animals too large to be seen, too still to be called wild. Then, the eyes appeared, not glowing, not cartoonish, just reflecting the lantern light. Dozens of them, fixed, patient. The woods held its breath. Marjorie stopped. Caleb felt her body shift, not back, just steadied. She stepped forward. Then they came. Shapes moved from the tree line, slow and sure, like shadows learning to walk. Not just one. Many, tall, fur-covered, powerful. Some broader than doorways. Others long-limbed and lean. They did not approach quickly. They didn't make a sound beyond the weight of their steps. A half circle formed around them, not tight, not aggressive, but watchful, contained. Caleb's hand gripped the side of the basket, his knees locked. The air smelled like crushed bark and sweat and wet earth. It wasn't fear. It was something older, reverence. Then the one he knew stepped forward, the younger one. Not as big as the others, but familiar now. His presence was less like a beast, more like a sentinel. He moved between Caleb and the others, stood tall, one arm raised slightly, fingers splayed like a signal. The others stilled. He turned to Marjorie, and for a long second, nothing moved. Then, slowly, she knelt, not out of submission, but understanding. She placed the basket on the ground and opened it. One by one, she laid out the things inside. Her hands moved with purpose, with memory. The herbs, the water, the blanket, the food. She looked up at him, not as a stranger, but as someone who once saved a life under the burden of falling snow. The young one made a sound, low, rhythmic. It echoed once through the trees. A few of the others stepped back, melting into the dark. The ones that remained kept their gaze fixed. He turned, gestured once, and began to walk. Caleb and Marjorie followed. The air thickened as they approached the cave. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons above the mouth, carrying that strange scent again, sap and moss and something like bone broth. When they entered, it was not with hesitation. It was with silence. Inside, the fire burned lower now. Its glow pulsed across the walls like breath, illuminating the faces of the tribe. Some watched, some rocked. One murmured soft clicks near a stone bowl filled with crushed roots. The old one was still on the stone bed, but his chest moved even slower now. Each breath seemed pulled from some far place. His eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. His fingers curled inward, twitching against the damp cloth laid over his shoulder. Marjorie knelt beside him. She didn't ask permission, but she moved with a kind of reverence that made words unnecessary. Caleb stood behind her, holding the lantern. She pulled the herbs, crushed them in her palm, added a drop of water, mixed until it formed a muddy paste. She rubbed it onto the elder's chest, above the heart, then touched his temples. Her fingers worked gently but firmly, tracing lines as if retracing old prayers. She whispered something, not to him, but to the room, to the moment, to the memory of a promise once made in the middle of a snowstorm when no one else had believed her. The tribe formed a circle around them. One of the larger creatures stepped forward, broad, fierce, fur matted from shoulder to waist. He let out a sharp bark, guttural and angry. He pointed one massive finger at Caleb, then at Marjorie, and made a lurching step forward. Caleb froze. Marjorie didn't move. Then the younger one stepped between them again, not with violence, but with his body. He placed both hands out, palms wide, spoke with his shoulders, his stance. The elder was breathing. That's all that mattered now. The larger one paused. Then something unexpected happened. He lowered his head, just slightly, then backed away. The younger one turned back to Caleb, eyes softer now. He made a low humming sound, then touched the side of his chest with a curled hand. Gratitude, Marjorie hummed low under her breath, a tune Caleb barely recognized, old, southern, wordless. A lullaby that might have been heard rocking on a porch in Georgia a century ago. The sound drifted through the cave, slow and trembling. One by one, the tribe began to lower their heads, not in mimicry, but in listening. Even the fire seemed to still. The elder's breath caught once, then released. Not final, just deeper, more present. The silence after the song was heavy, not empty. Caleb stood with the lantern. Light flickered against the stone. The cave felt less like a den, more like a cathedral. Outside, wind stirred the trees again, not wild, but waiting. The mouth of the cave yawned wider behind them as they stepped in, and the shadows swallowed their figures like a curtain closing behind the final act of a play no human was meant to witness. The fire still burned, but lower now, just a circle of coals breathing faint orange light into the darkness. It flickered against the slick stone walls, bouncing off the rough contours of fur-covered shoulders and hunched silhouettes. No one moved, not a breath, not a sound. The silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet. It was deliberate, sacred, like the walls of the place demanded it. Marjorie and Caleb stood at the edge of something not meant to be entered but allowed, just this once, because the rules had bent for them. And even then, only barely. The air hung heavy, thick with smoke and damp from the condensation that ran in tiny streams down the rocks. The tribe stood in a circle, forming a wall of flesh and silence around the elder who still lay motionless on the raised slab of stone. His chest rose like a whisper, barely enough to call it breath. The paste Marjorie had applied was beginning to dry, darkening at the edges. It sent curling with steam above his skin. Caleb could feel the fire's heat on his neck, but it did nothing to thaw the chill pressing into his spine. He felt like he was standing between two realities, one built on wood smoke and memories, and the other on instinct and ancient blood. They knelt again, the boy beside the old woman. Her hands moved with care, like she was wrapping a wound she'd felt in herself before. She whispered something under her breath, not English, not words even, just vibrations from the back of her throat. A sound as old as lullabies and burial hymns. Across the circle, one of the younger females, smaller, narrower shoulders, wide-set amber eyes, mirrored the motion with her hands, pressing something like sap or oil into the crook of the elder's elbow. Caleb's heart was pounding again. He didn't understand how he could feel so afraid without feeling in danger, like something enormous was about to happen. But it didn't involve violence. It involved him, somehow. He stared at the faces around the cave. Faces that weren't quite human and weren't quite beast. Faces that had no need for words, because their eyes said everything. And what they said now was simple. Do not fail us. The elder's breathing hitched. One long exhale. A pause. Then nothing. Marjorie froze. Her hand rested against the elder's sternum. Her head bowed. Caleb leaned forward, eyes wide. The circle stirred. A low sound rippled around the cave, deep, trembling. Not loud, but endless. One of the larger males stepped forward, dropped to one knee beside the elder, placed both hands on the stone, and let out a sound so guttural it shook dust from the cave ceiling. His lips curled back. Not in rage, but grief. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that burrows. Another took a step forward, then another. Shoulders twitched. Fur bristled. The air snapped. And then one of them, tall, broad, with a scar running down the right side of his face, let out a sound like nothing Caleb had ever heard. It was sharp, cutting, primal, rage wrapped in despair. He slammed his fist into the stone wall, sending a spray of dust and rock across the floor, then turned, growling, and took a hard step toward Marjorie. Caleb scrambled to his feet, heart in his throat. The figure bore down on them, chest heaving, teeth bared. Marjorie didn't move. She didn't even blink. And before the beast could close the distance, the younger one stepped between them. It was instant. A wall of fur and muscle stood in front of them, arms wide. He didn't growl. He didn't attack. He just stood. Still. Solid. A statement in silence. The elder behind them took in a shallow breath. Marjorie's hand pressed deeper into his chest. The growling stopped. The circle froze again. The younger one turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back at Caleb. His eyes weren't afraid. They were pleading. Marjorie leaned forward and sang. It wasn't a song meant to fill a room. It was the kind meant to keep something alive. Just a single voice, low and cracked with time. The melody barely held together, just enough thread to carry the tune across the stone walls. Caleb had heard it before. The same song she used to hum when storms came too close to the cabin, when thunder cracked and the lights flickered. He never knew the words. He didn't think there were any. The effect was immediate. The circle began to shift. Shoulders lowered. Eyes softened. Some placed a hand to their chest, others to the floor. A shared rhythm returned, like a heartbeat echoing in the cavern's ribs. The younger one lowered his arms, and then the elder moved. Not much, just a twitch of his fingers. Then another. A slow, labored breath rattled through his lungs. Marjorie's voice caught in her throat. Her hands trembled. The younger one knelt beside them, his massive hand hovering just inches from the old one's chest. And then, slowly, the elder opened one eye. It was dim, clouded, but it turned, it looked, and the room fell completely silent again. Every creature in the cave sank to one knee. Caleb stood frozen, his mouth dry, hands clenched. He saw the elder's hand rise, unsteady and heavy like lifting a boulder. It came up, hovered in the air, then dropped gently onto Caleb's shoulder. The weight of it didn't push him down. It grounded him. The boy didn't cry, but something inside him cracked open. For a moment, the firelight looked like sunlight. For a moment, the cave felt like home. Marjorie let out a shaky breath. The younger one reached forward and placed his hand gently on hers, and all around them, the others bowed their heads in unison. Not one of them spoke, but something had been spoken, not in words, not even in gesture, just in presence. The circle loosened. The air shifted. The younger one helped Caleb to his feet. The old hand slid from his shoulder like the last breath of a storm moving on. Marjorie looked around the room one last time before rising. Caleb took one final glance at the elder, who now stared into the fire like it held something only he could read. And together, the two of them walked out of the cave. The tribe didn't follow, but they watched, not as guards, not even as friends, as kin. When they reached the mouth of the cave, the night had turned colder, but the wind had softened. The trees didn't seem so heavy anymore. The forest didn't hum with warning. It hummed with memory. They walked back through the underbrush, past the roots and stones and branches that had felt so daunting before. This time, no one blocked their path. No eyes glinted from the trees. The younger one followed behind them, just out of view, just close enough for them to know they weren't alone. Back at the cabin, the fire had gone out. Boone sat by the door, wagging his tail once, then curling back into his spot without a sound. Marjorie took off her coat. Caleb sat on the floor by the hearth. Neither of them said much. But in the silence there was warmth. There was something new, something wild and sacred and shared. And out in the woods, hidden from the world, the elder slept and dreamed and healed. Morning didn't break in Pine Hollow. It exhaled, slow and silver and soft, like the forest was waking from a dream it wasn't ready to leave. Fog hung low over the ridges, clinging to the needles of the tallest trees, curling around trunks like it had something to protect. The first light of day barely reached the forest floor, but what little did touched the mouth of the cave like a whisper, warm and gold and sacred. It moved in beams across the stone, slipping into the hollow where the elder lay, and with it came the breath. Not loud, not sudden, just one slow inhale, drawn deep into old lungs that hadn't moved with strength in days. Then another, and another. Inside, the tribe stood still, arms low, heads bowed. They had not left through the night. They hadn't spoken, hadn't shifted more than necessary. The only movements were the quiet turn of eyes, the flick of fur in the firelight, the press of knuckles into the earth when the wind changed. Marjorie sat close, her hands in her lap. The last of the paste rubbed clean from her palms. Her shoulders ached, her hips screamed, but she stayed, eyes on him. On the chest that now moved with rhythm, with life. Caleb stood behind her, feet bare against the stone, lantern long since gone cold. He watched the elder's face change. The lines eased, the brow loosened. His mouth parted with a sound that wasn't a word, wasn't even human, but it was real. It was presence, return. And when that breath came steady enough to shape sound, the others answered, not in voice, but in breath. One by one, they made it. A sound not unlike a low hum, not deep enough to be threatening, not light enough to be mournful. A tone of arrival, gratitude, recognition. It passed through the chamber like wind through dry leaves. Each creature placed a hand over their own chest. Some bowed slightly, others touched the ground. The fire cracked just once, as if marking the moment. The younger one stepped forward, not boldly, not to take space, but to bear witness. He crouched beside Caleb, shoulder brushing his, hand resting gently on his knee. Then he turned toward the stone platform and placed one hand on the elder's arm. The elder stirred, and then, impossibly, sat upright. His spine curved, muscles slow to catch up, but he rose with the weight of something returned. His head lifted, eyes opened, both now, still cloudy but clear enough to find the shapes in front of him. His gaze found Caleb, and it didn't just rest there. It held, saw, knew. Caleb didn't move. He couldn't. The elder reached out. A massive hand, fur darkened with time, calloused and thick. It landed on Caleb's shoulder again, just like before, but this time it stayed, and the boy let his eyes close, not to hide, but to accept it, to memorize it, the weight, the heat, the pulse of something that had been waiting years to be passed down. Then the elder turned to Marjorie. His mouth parted slightly. A sound came, a low vibration from deep inside. It wasn't human, but it carried the shape of intention. She didn't need to translate it. She understood. She pressed her palm gently over his, tears warming her cheeks. Not from sadness, but from relief. In that silence, something shifted. The scarred male, the one who had nearly lunged the night before, stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. His footsteps echoed off the stone, each one loud and final, like a drumbeat beneath the earth. He stopped just a few feet away from them, lowered to one knee, bowed his head. Then he placed one hand on his own chest, curled inward like a folded leaf. And for the first time since they entered that cave, Marjorie saw something new. Reverence. Behind him, the others followed. Dozens of them. They bent their knees, touched their hearts, and faced her, not as outsiders, not as intruders, but as keepers of a pact. Caleb reached for her hand, found it trembling. She squeezed his fingers. "I told you," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Some things aren't meant to be claimed, only honored." The elder lay back against the stone, eyes closing again, not from weakness, but from peace. Sleep, real sleep, washed over him, and his breath stayed steady. The fire dimmed, but the warmth remained. The younger one stood, turning toward the entrance. He looked back once, and Caleb knew it was time. Marjorie rose slowly. Her knees cracked in the quiet. She looked back at the elder, nodded once. They followed the younger one out of the cave, stepping into morning's breath. The fog had thinned now. The trees shimmered with dew. The sun filtered through the canopy like a memory of something once promised. Behind them, the tribe remained, the air no longer heavy with worry, the hush no longer choked with fear. Something had healed, not just flesh, but the space between. As they walked down the slope, the younger one remained behind them just far enough to let them lead. But Caleb felt him there, each step, each shift in the brush, a rhythm of guardianship. When they reached the ridge near the cabin, he stopped. Caleb turned. The creature stood tall in the early light, chest rising with calm. He tapped a single finger to his own chest, then pointed to Caleb. The boy nodded. No smile, no words, just a connection, a line unbroken. Then the creature turned and vanished into the trees. Marjorie didn't speak until they reached the porch. She looked out at the tree line, eyes narrowed, then quietly said, "They'll remember this." Caleb looked up at her. "So will we," he replied. She nodded once, then opened the cabin door. Inside, the fire was cold, but the space felt different. Not haunted, not sacred, just full. Of memory, of promise, of something bigger than both of them. That night, neither of them spoke much, but when the wind picked up just after sundown, they both looked toward the trees. And when 3 knocks came softly through the dark, spaced just enough to matter, they didn't flinch. They just listened and breathed. It began in silence, not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that means something is about to end. A hush that wasn't fear and wasn't grief, but something in between. A farewell whispered through pine needles and frost-bitten ground. Caleb felt it before he saw it. In the way the wind had shifted direction, in the stillness of the trees, in the way Boone didn't bark that morning, only paced by the door and stared into the woods like he knew. He pulled on his boots without tying them, threw his jacket over bare arms, didn't even zip it. The morning air hit his chest like cold water, but he didn't flinch. He stepped outside and the cabin door creaked behind him, long and slow, like even it didn't want to close. The forest stood quiet. He knew the path now, not because he'd memorized it, but because his body had. His feet found each root, each rock, like they'd walked it for years. He didn't stop, didn't call out. He just kept moving, breath short in his lungs, eyes scanning the trees like he could feel them slipping through his fingers. And then he saw them. In the clearing near the old ravine, the tribe stood, clustered yet distant. No voices, no movement. Just the weight of them in the morning fog, shoulders hunched, heads bowed slightly as though waiting for something only the forest could give. At the front, the younger one stood taller than the rest, his shoulders square, his fur catching the morning light in bronze streaks. His eyes were already on Caleb. Not surprised, not sad, just steady. They were leaving. Not tomorrow, not later, now. And Caleb hadn't known how much it would hurt until that moment, until he saw them all there, silent giants, the ones who had let him in, let him see what no one else ever would, the ones who had made space for his fear, his questions, his presence. His breath caught. He ran, faster than he should have, feet slipping on the frosted moss. He reached them, chest heaving, hands clenched. The tribe didn't back away, didn't stop him, but they didn't move toward him either. They were already gone in the ways that mattered. Only the younger one stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He raised one hand, large and dark, and placed it on his own chest, then tapped once, then turned the hand outward, toward Caleb. The boy stood frozen, and then nodded. His eyes stung, but he didn't cry. He didn't want to send them away with tears. He wanted them to know he understood, that some things don't last because they were never meant to, that moments could still be real even when they were short. The younger one reached out again. His hand hovered over Caleb's shoulder, then gently rested there and stayed, just long enough for the warmth to settle. Then he let go. Caleb watched as the younger one turned to join the others. One by one, they moved into the trees. Not running, not afraid, just returning. Fur sliding between trunks. Massive feet moving without sound. Shadows becoming shadow. And then they were gone. Just the clearing, the fog, the breath in his chest, and the silence they left behind. He stood there a long time, letting the air settle around him, letting the weight of goodbye fall quiet across his shoulders. Then he turned, and that's when he saw it. Near the base of a leaning cedar, just where the frost hadn't touched. Something glinted. He stepped closer, crouched down, brushed the moss away with the sleeve of his coat. It was a stone, palm-sized, smooth on one side, rough on the other. Etched into the surface were 3 parallel lines, not carved deep, but unmistakable. 3 marks, like 3 breaths, like 3 knocks. He picked it up and held it close. It was warm, not from the sun, but from memory. He turned it over in his hand. His thumb traced the grooves again and again. He didn't need anyone to explain what it meant. It wasn't just a gift, it was a sign, a tether, a promise. He slipped it into his pocket, close to his skin, and walked home without speaking. Back at the cabin, Marjorie stood on the porch, arms crossed. She didn't ask where he'd gone. She just looked at his face and knew. "They're gone," he said. She nodded once. Caleb reached into his pocket, pulled out the stone, and held it up to her. Her eyes softened. "They left you that?" "I think they left us both." She stepped closer, ran her fingers across the lines. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Then she handed it back to him. "Keep it close," she said. "Not just to remember, but to honor." He did. He kept it in the pocket of his jacket that winter. And in the spring, he tied it around a piece of leather cord and wore it beneath his shirt. He never took it off. He didn't need to explain it to anyone, and he never tried. Because some things aren't meant to be told. They're meant to be kept, like breath, like sacred ground, or like the moment before the forest speaks again. And sometimes, late at night when the wind shifts just right, Caleb sits up in bed and swears he hears it. 3 knocks, far off, soft, but clear, and he smiles. Not because he expects to see them again, but because he knows they're still out there. And somehow, that's enough. Weeks passed, but the quiet stayed. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but full of everything you couldn't explain. Sounds still came, branches creaking, wind moving low across the roof, Boone scratching at the woodpile. But underneath it all, there was a hush, like something sacred had passed through and never truly left. Caleb stopped checking the woods each morning. He didn't need to anymore. There were no footprints now. No gifts at the tree line. No knocks after dark. Just the forest. As it had always been. As it would always be. But something in it had shifted. Like it remembered him. And the remembering was enough. The stone stayed around his neck. 3 shallow lines, rubbed smooth by his fingers. He touched it when the wind picked up. When he felt alone. When the nights got long and sleep stayed just out of reach. He didn't show it to anyone. Not even Marjorie. But he knew she knew he wore it. The way she'd glance at his chest sometimes when he stepped inside. The way her eyes softened when he tugged it beneath his collar. It wasn't about keeping the secret. It was about keeping it sacred. They didn't talk much about what happened. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't need words. Some stories weren't made for retelling. They were meant to be lived through once, then carried like a weight you chose to hold close. Sometimes Caleb would sit on the porch just before dusk, the dog curled at his feet, the trees standing still as statues. He'd watch the light change, how it slid down the bark like honey, how it vanished behind the ridge like it was being pulled gently away by invisible hands. That last hour of sun always felt different now, like a warning, or a promise, or both. It had been nearly a month when Marjorie told him they should go back, not to stay, just to look. They packed light, just a small basket with cornbread, a thermos of tea, 2 wool blankets in case the cold returned before they did. Boone didn't follow them this time. He just watched from the porch, ears up, tail still, like he understood this part wasn't for him. The trail hadn't changed. The forest had. It felt more open now, not in space, but in spirit. As if the land itself knew they were coming back not out of curiosity, but out of respect. They reached the ridge just before sundown. The same slope, the same break in the trees. But the clearing was empty, the moss undisturbed, the rocks cold. The mouth of the cave was still there, half hidden behind ferns and hanging vines. But there were no footprints, no fire scent, no breath. Just wine curling through the stone like it was checking to see if anything remained. Caleb stepped forward first. Slow, careful. Marjorie followed behind him, her boots crunching softly over the pine needles. They didn't speak. The only sound was the hush of their own movement. Inside the cave it was darker than before. The fire pit was long cold. The bedding of moss and bark had withered, dried out. No warmth clung to the stones. It was hollow, but not abandoned. It felt returned, like something had been borrowed for a time and now given back. Caleb didn't move further in. He stood just at the edge of where the firelight used to reach. He looked up. The ceiling arched like a frozen wave, jagged and black, speckled with spots where soot had stained the stone. Shadows danced faintly where the last of the daylight crept through the cracks above. The same space that had once held dozens now held only memory, and memory didn't echo. It just stayed quiet and deep. Marjorie stepped beside him. She looked around once, then smiled. Not because she was happy, but because she knew what it meant. "They've gone," Caleb whispered. "Yes," she said. He pulled the stone from under his shirt, held it in his palm. Marjorie reached over and placed her hand beneath his, the way someone steadies a candle in the wind. "They left what matters," she said. He nodded. They didn't stay long. They didn't need to. The forest had said its piece, and now it was up to them to carry the silence. When they got home, the last light of the day was slipping through the cabin windows, long and low and golden. The kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was. Dust hung in the air like flecks of time. The table was bare, the fireplace cold, but it didn't feel empty. It felt honest. Caleb sat on the porch while Marjorie brewed tea. He traced the stone in his fingers. The 3 lines now felt less like marks and more like paths. Not roads to follow, but reminders of what passed, of what stayed, of what waited. He didn't hear her step outside, but he felt her sit next to him. The mug in her hand steamed in the cold air. They sat like that for a long time, watching the sun disappear behind the trees, watching the light pull its fingers from the tops of the pines, watching the hollow slip back into the hollow. And then Caleb spoke. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" Marjorie looked out into the fading woods. The sky had turned the color of ash and rose. "I don't know," she said. "But the forest keeps its secrets. That much I've learned." He turned the stone over again. "Do you think they still remember us?" Marjorie smiled faintly. "Tenderness doesn't vanish, Caleb. It just changes shape." He nodded. Didn't speak again. The air cooled fast after that. The kind of cold that wasn't just about temperature, but season, change, time moving on. They went inside before the frost came. Closed the door, but left the curtains open. Let the dark settle around them like an old friend. And out there, somewhere in the distance, Pine Hollow breathed in the last light of another quiet evening. Not because the story had ended, but because it had become part of the place, and part of them. Some stories don't end. They quiet down. They settle like morning mist on the ridge, like the last embers of a long-kept fire. And if you listen closely, you can still feel them breathing beneath the soil, humming under the bark, moving softly through the spaces we too often rush past. Because there are truths that don't ask to be proven, bonds that don't fit in books, and moments so fragile they only survive when held in silence, not spoken aloud. This was never a story about monsters or myths. It was about what happens when we choose to see, not just with our eyes, but with patience, with stillness, with the kind of listening that takes root in the heart long before it reaches the ears. It's a reminder that not all bridges are built with hands. Some are grown with trust. Some are carved by quiet gestures, by the offering of warmth without demand, by the courage it takes to kneel instead of conquer, and to protect something not because we own it, but because we understand it was never ours to begin with. And in a world that often forgets how to slow down, how to look past fear and into wonder, these stories return to us like lanterns in the dark, small, glowing truths that ask only to be honored, not captured, not explained, just remembered. Maybe the forest isn't waiting to be discovered. Maybe it's waiting to be respected. And maybe the greatest connection we'll ever find isn't made through force or proof or noise, but through compassion, through stillness, through the kind of presence that says, I see you. I will not harm you. I remember you. If this story found you, it's because you were ready to hear it. And if it stayed with you, even just a little, then maybe there's a part of you that's still reaching for something deeper, something older than fear, something wilder than language, something tender enough to hold on to in the quiet moments between days. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this story moved you or left a mark in your chest that you can't quite name, please consider leaving a comment below. We'd love to hear what part stayed with you. And if you'd like more stories like this, quiet, human, rooted in the wild, don't forget to follow the channel and subscribe. Your presence keeps the fire going. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never stop listening for the knocks that come in threes.